I'd like to introduce former longtime Harvard Business School professor and currently visiting professor of management practice at Said Business School at Oxford University, Robert G. Eccles. I met Bob at Harvard Business School in the doctoral program in a course called The Role of the Corporation in Society. Bob is the founding chairman of SASB. He's on the board of trustees of True Value Labs, an advisor to investors and companies all around the world. So with that, I'd like to introduce my co-author, continuing research collaborator, and friend for more than a few years, Robert G. Eccles.
Thanks, Tim. You could have gone on a little bit longer. To be honest, I'm not feeling all that good about myself this afternoon. If you look at the panelists, Erica Karp, she's not here. Graham McMillan, he's not here. They're the ones I'm closest to. They're my friends. They blew me off. So I'm feeling a little sensitive right now, just to put that in perspective. On the end, Sarah Williamson, who is the CEO of FCLT Global. I've known her probably the longest. She still hasn't said she'll be my friend. So I'm kind of working on this. Marjorie Paloma is Senior Director of the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. We met briefly once. She doesn't even recognize me, probably. Sitting next to her is Amy Springsteel, who's the VP of Corporate Responsibility from Voya. We shared a dinner, a group dinner, a while ago.
I'm still deciding about the friend.
You're still deciding about the friend thing. You probably don't even remember the dinner. And it was at that same dinner that I met Glenn Booraem, who's the investment stewardship officer at Vanguard. Vanguard represents about 20% of that 25 trillion in AUM that's been talked about. So it's like 4.5 trillion. Glenn, that's a lot of money.
Yes, it is.
You know, it's more money than any person needs, to be honest. So if I think about people that I'm trying to persuade to be my friends, Sarah runs a nonprofit. She could use some money, right? Marjorie's at a foundation. She could use some money. You're probably fine. You don't need any money. You could give the money that you're going to give to her to me, and then double it up, okay? So that's kind of the objective on this thing. We're all going to become friends, and we're going to get some money out of you. So let me explain kind of what the general format is going to be. Because it's this panel, and it's some remarks from Daryl, and then it's cocktails. So I'm going to kind of start it off with a question for probably about the same question for each of the panelists. In the first part, what I want to do is basically debrief today, which I think has been very interesting. See what we can learn, get reactions, what things kind of stood out to us. I'll then kind of segue into, are there some lessons that we can learn and maybe some advice that we can give to what I think is a great initiative for Daryl and for Mark and for Tim, and then we'll turn it over. You have to fill out those forms if you want to go to the cocktail reception. You have to do that and do a good job on the panel to be admitted to the cocktail reception, but you can buy your way out. So, you know, you've got options.
Just to be clear, Bob, that's all other people's money.
That's fine. And I'm hoping that some of that's going to be my money by the time we get to the end of the panel. So let me start with this question, because I was kind of scratching my head on this all during the day. It's kind of an existential question. I was trying to say, are these long-term plans that these people are presenting, right? All the presentations were interesting, they were different. So from the perspective of really a long-term shareholder because of your investment strategy, did these feel like long-term plans to you in general that the people presented today?
On balance, no, to be candid. I think what I come away with is a great perspective on a number of companies, all of which our funds own in substantial numbers. We own 5, 6, 7% of most companies. I don't know specifically about the companies that present today, but we're a significant owner everywhere. And what I come away with is a great perspective on where a lot of those companies have been, what they do, some of the significant drivers as they think about the things confronting them going forward. But what I would have liked to see more on balance is more prospective thinking. What are the big risks confronting these firms as they go into the future? How do they expect their strategies to change and evolve in response to those risks? How do those changes translate into things they're thinking about around the composition of their board, who serve on investors' behalf, the way they're thinking about compensation of their senior executives. So I think I certainly come away with a better appreciation for a number of these firms, and to varying degrees a sense for where they're going forward. But across the board, do I think we heard long-term, what I would classify as long-term plans from everybody? I think we still have some more work to do.
Were any of these, I mean, here's the list, did any of these feel more like a long-term plan presentation than others to you?
Yeah, I mean, I think from my standpoint, I got a little more of a forward-looking sense from Kevin at Delphi, from Johan at Telia, and though not in the same form, I think probably from Mark at Pru. I think those were probably the three from my standpoint that had the most forward-looking perspective.
So let me turn to Sarah, and maybe you could start by giving a little bit of background on FCLT Global, and what you're doing is like directly relevant to this whole thing. So I think your perspective on whether these were really long-term plans or not, from what your expectations would be quite interesting.
Great, thanks. So just a quick background on FCLT Global. We were started as the Focusing Capital on the Long-Term Initiative about 4 years ago by a consortium of asset owners, including CPBIB, GIC, a number of very large asset owners, asset managers, including BlackRock, State Street, Schroders, Wellington, and others are members now, and large corporations such as BP, Unilever, Dow, Tata. And the idea is simply, I think actually RuPaul referred to this as sort of who's the enemy, and it's ourselves. And the idea, simply put, is that if you think about savers, they tend to be very, very long-term. They have long-term goals. They're saving for their retirement or the next generation, whatever it may be. And at the other end of the capital spectrum, you have people with an idea that need capital, management teams or entrepreneurs, whoever they are, to enter a new market or develop a new product. And those tend to be very long-term ideas. But the capital allocation process that we use in the public markets in particular means that the assets go from an asset owner to an asset manager to a publicly listed corporation. And in that process, we have gotten very, very short-term. So our goal is essentially to bring those three parties together, and rather than everybody saying, well, I'm long-term, but those other people are short-term, get all those other people at the same table. And so to answer your question, Bob, in terms of my impression of some of these presentations today, I think that what I would say is it's hard for people to be very long-term because so many executives have been trained by these markets to be very short-term. And I think there's sort of a redefinition process that goes forward. And so I guess the two quick things I would say, one is that we have done a lot of work, which is about to be published, on quarterly guidance and the whole issue of quarterly guidance and how that drives some behavior. And you know, the quick punchline is that quarterly guidance is declining pretty dramatically. Only 27% of the S&P 500 issues it anymore. It's essentially zero in Europe. We've done very good work in connection with some people at Harvard Business School. There's no impact on volatility. There's no credibility premium for offering quarterly guidance. Those are myths. And the buy side doesn't want it. Less than 7% of the buy side wants any sort of metrics that have to do with less than a year. So the reason that people tend to give quarterly guidance is based on some some very outdated thinking in general, and so we do see that going away. So our belief is that as quarterly guidance continues to go away, the replacement for that is these very long-term plans. And so the way that I think about those is that most companies have probably 5 or 6, whatever the number is, KPIs that they think about driving their business. And they can be very different for different businesses. It might be the number of patents. It might be the number of customers who walk through a door. It might be anything that is relevant to that particular business. And the goal of laying out a few of those and being able to actually track them over time and talk about how they tie to the actual performance of the business is what I think really matters in terms of forward-looking long-term plans. And there are a number of companies who have done this and done it well, and we've got some examples of them, but it's not easy.
So one thing you would say is more kind of identify the long-term KPIs, kind of what targets are on them, and anything else that you'd say to make these presentations more kind of long-term planish?
So I think, you know, I'm a numbers person. I was at Wellington Management for over 20 years. I like numbers. So I think that most charts that talk about long-term performance ought to have a year on them or a number of years and some numbers. So it ought to be a range or an indication. And so I think that several of the presentations we saw, which I thought were excellent, were more about mission or aspirations, and I think those are also very important, but that is a little bit different in my mind than a long-term plan, which means that we hope to get to X point by this particular point in time, or thinking about the long-term plan and sharing some of the metrics that go into it. So for example, I think Glencore has done a very good job with their long-term plan, and that's a commodities company. So obviously the price of the commodity is extremely important in whether they hit that or not. So being very clear about what are those drivers, and if they're wrong on the price of the commodity, then obviously their forecasts are going to be wrong. But you can figure that out, so that gives you some indication of what's really driving the company.
Thank you. Marjorie?
Yes.
What was your perspective? I mean, you're from a foundation, you're by definition very long-term. Did these feel like long-term plans to you or not?
So I think they're on their way. And let me just talk a little bit, because I feel like an odd duck in the room, because I'm from health philanthropy, and what we are focused on is really building a culture of health in America. Really, what that means is shifting mindsets and values of our country to put health into the core. And we believe that the private sector has a critical role to play. And in the work that we're doing in engaging the private sector, we really want to really catalyze private sector leaders to promote health in all of the business functions, whether it's through their engagement with employees and their families, whether it's through consumers and their products, or their connections with the environment and sustainability, and also with their work in communities. And what was really interesting about what you just said about KPIs is that what we really see our role as is looking at the research and evidence to identify what are the kinds of measures across the spectrum that really matter for health, that improve the health of our nation, that improve the health of our communities, and also applying the business lens that really came up in this discussion about what matters for health and what matters for business. Because what we heard is that shareholders, we have to return to shareholders. And what I saw in the conversation today was actually more health than I thought I would see. So there were a couple of examples of companies talking about their connection with communities as anchor institutions. We heard from Prudential in Newark. We heard from other folks thinking about what is their relationship to their employees. Mark Bertolini, yes, he's a healthcare industry company, but he also talked about how do you shift and think about the workers and provide a wage that will allow families and the employees to make better decisions. The reality is that the healthcare crisis is one that hurts and affects businesses more than we've talked about in today's discussion. But what I really appreciated is that throughout the conversations, we heard about how all of the issues that lie outside of the healthcare system, whether it's financial well-being, whether it is education, these are things that influence health, which we know influences health outcomes.
Let me ask you kind of a follow-up question. One of the trends I see is that probably more the investment community is kind of starting to anchor on the SDGs, sort of looking through that lens and where they see opportunities. Corporate community, sort of, all kinds of events going on in New York this week around it with the Global Compact. As I recall, two of the companies explicitly talked about the SDGs. It was Telia and it was 3M. And the others didn't. But we had healthcare companies, and SDG 3 is health and well-being. And I kind of happen to remember that for whatever reason. I don't remember a lot, but I happen to remember that one. Would you have expected to see more? Because there was a lot of talk about impact and CSR and sustainability. Would it have been helpful if these long-term plans would have had more explicit linkages to the SDGs that they think are relevant for their business?
I think the power of the SDGs is really about galvanizing support across business communities, nonprofits, NGOs, and also government to really focus in on the top 17 goals. I think it would be good. Again, it is about bringing together the power to focus in on those top 17 issues. What I appreciate about the SDGs is that number 3 is about health and well-being. But across the board, it talks about equity, so that folks who don't have the opportunity, that we really focus in on what people need. It talks about gender equality. We talk about education, and it is, again, lifting up what are the societal issues that really affect not just businesses, but NGOs, governments. So I would have loved to have seen more of that.
So Amy, thank you for being on this panel with about 30 seconds notice, as far as I can tell from Tim. So you're doing double duty, right? You had your CEO present a long-term plan, and now you're on the panel. But it gives you an interesting perspective. When you think back on all the presentations you saw, is there anything that any of the other CEOs did that you'd say, that was interesting? You know, I could see the next time Rodney was to present a long-term plan, I'd like to try and incorporate that particular feature in what we're doing. Anything kind of stand out at you?
I think it was more the questions that came to him afterwards about topics that we didn't address necessarily, so that we now want to start to incorporate that, and also the questions that came to other CEOs for us to incorporate more of those topics in the presentation.
So kind of asking the same question for other members of the panel, in what order? Anything strike you? Anything, plans that were particularly interesting? Any points people made? Any patterns that you saw that you take away? Because it's like we're running a natural experiment here, right?
So can I add to, I thought one thing that came out to me, at least time and again, was the role of the board. And a number of people mentioned that, and either it was explicit in their presentation, such as they had the diversity of their board, or I think Raj from Roman Haas talked a lot about the board. And that was something that I don't think I remembered seeing in the previous presentation, the last time, that it was much more on the company. But this whole idea of, is the board thinking about these issues? Is the board long-term? Do you have the right people in the room? It'd be pretty hard for one of these companies to get on the right path with the wrong board. And that sounds really obvious, but I think sometimes we forget that. So thinking about the role of the board just struck me again and again in these presentations today.
There's a common theme that you saw. Any other things people noticed, themes, things that stood out, particularly interesting?
Yeah, I would just say one point of convergence on a lot of the messages was the recognition that the hard distinction between financial and quote-unquote non-financial issues starts to dissipate the longer your time horizon is. You know, I think Mark made the point, Mark Greer made the point, when your time horizon's long enough, everything matters. And I think that's one of the things we think about from, you know, our perspective as an index. As largely an index investor, we're going to be permanent holders. So, you know, understanding the way a lot of these issues will play out over time, and to piggyback on Sarah's point, how the board's involvement in overseeing and managing those risks plays out with management. But I think the the recognition and acknowledgement that as if you look with a long enough time horizon, the distinction between financial and I think I've heard some people refer to them as not yet financial matters really starts to dissipate.
Amy, Marjorie, anything?
I've got two big, I've got five, but two that I want to lift up, which is the role of the investors. And someone earlier talked about everything we own has impact, and it's really our job as investors, or your job as investors, to think about positive or negative. And also we heard, I think it was Tom Wilson, talk about not being asked by investors the questions that really matters. And I think that really crystallizes the role of the investor. The other is the changing role of consumers. So we heard across so many of the presentations about how consumers with technology have the ability to call out different aspects of a company. We've talked a little bit, heard a little bit about reputation. And I think in thinking about the current millennial generation, who is on so many people's minds, being the largest generation of our time, that is calling on businesses to take a position on different things, to really lead with purpose and values. I think that's something that we've got to pay attention to.
Great, thanks. Amy?
Well, I would just say from, this doesn't exactly answer your question, but from our experience and our perspective, this enabled more collaboration than we had in the past in the company. Our investor relations team, our team, the corporate responsibility team, and our corporate communications folks spoke to each other in a different way than we do for other presentations or other initiatives. And we had State Street and other folks come up to us afterwards and want to collaborate on things so that we normally wouldn't have had those conversations. So I appreciate that about this initiative. I think it allowed us to tell a more holistic story about the company and where we plan to go. And while we may not have had metrics to cite quite yet, because we're still in the middle of that long-term journey, we were able to talk about initiatives that in other forums they're not necessarily interested in. So we appreciated that.
So let me tell you one thing that struck me, and I'll ask the panel which was the cause. So my impression was that the presentation by Johan Denneland at Telia was incredibly candid, right? There was the good news and there was the bad news. And with the rest that were all US CEOs, it was pretty much, here's the good news, okay? So what are we looking at here? Do you think it's a US-European thing? Or do you think it's just here's a company that recently had a crisis thing? What do you think is the underlying variable in the differences? US versus Europe, or just coming out of a crisis, and if we had a US CEO that had gone through the same thing and $1 billion put away to pay for fines and corruption in Uzbekistan and a whole long story, we would have gotten the same thing from a US CEO, a US Telia CEO.
I'll give you my guess, but I'm not sure I have evidence for it, which is I do think that U.S. CEOs in general are both more optimistic or the glass is half full, and also, frankly, more worried about liability. So they don't want to say, it's harder for them to say, we got a problem, we screwed up because of the litigious. I think, how many of the U.S. CEOs, I think all of them, put up the disclosure, the forward-looking, and so I've been in many investor meetings where you ask a CEO a question and he or she sort of looks at the IR person and says, am I allowed to answer that question? So I think that may be part of it.
Other views? Crisis or Europe versus U.S.? Anybody have a guess? No? Whatever. So let me open it up for questions, and there's one last question I'm going to ask everybody. But here's an opportunity for people in the audience. Oh, so you still love me. You're not getting drinks, but I'm glad you're here. Questions for the panel? All right, come on, Erica.
You were in that.
Well, apparently it does now. I mean, I've never seen this motif before, but whatever.
So, nuance. There's a lot of nuance in corporate governance and in investing sustainably and everything else. Do you guys think, and I don't know who wants to take this one, but the nexus issues, so when it comes to healthcare and the environment, or women and automation, or water and geopolitics, all those nexus issues, do you have any way to try to figure out which companies and which asset managers, which investors might really get those? Because if we don't get the complexity, we're not going to have as much progress as we need to. So I don't know who wants to take that one.
Go ahead. It's a hard one.
For me? Man. You want to come up, Eric?
You can still switch.
Yeah.
You can still switch. You can have your time on the panel, Erica.
Let me
Sure, go.
talk a little bit, because I think that that is part of the role of the foundation world. Not necessarily, I can't tell you which investors to focus in on, but what I can say is that, you know, what we pride ourselves on at the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation is really being able to look at the science and the evidence and the research. And so what we're supporting right now is a set of research, one really looking at what matters in health. What are the kinds of measures that that have a real impact on improving the health of individuals in our country, and also thinking about what really matters in terms of returns, right? I think it's a balance at looking at the evidence, and I think the key is in supporting common sets of metrics that are validated, that look at the impact, being able to say at the end of the day which measures matter, and for a company and for an investment group to say which measures matter to my company, which ones align with my values and missions, which ones align with my way of investing. But I think from our standpoint, really being able to provide evidence and learnings that could help investors and companies make smarter decisions when it comes to health.
So I'll take a shot at that if it's helpful. I mean, one of the things that we're working on are what are risks to long-term capital. So if you're a short-term investor and you're going to hold a stock for 30 days or 30 minutes, you don't really care about any of those things that you just mentioned, right? But if you're a long-term investor, either a permanent investor like somebody like Vanguard, or just a very large investor like many of the sovereign wealth funds who are essentially going to own a lot of things forever, you really need to think about the risk to long-term capital. And some of those risks are fairly easy to measure. So, for example, demographics. You know, the people who are 15 today ought to be 20 in 5 years. And so you ought to be able to figure that out, right? That's a fairly narrow distribution. Some are harder. So climate change, for example, there's a wider distribution there. And some are really hard, like perhaps geopolitical risks, and that act more, that are very, very hard to predict. And so the way that I think about the interaction of these various things is, from an investment point of view, is sort of what are the range of risks that a long-term investor should be thinking about that maybe a short-term investor doesn't need to be. That probably means they're not very well incorporated into the market, since most people are not thinking about them, and frankly they're hard to think about. And then what is the dispersion of potential returns for each of those risks? And then, to your point, how do you put those together? And are they completely independent variables, or do they have some correlation among them? It's not easy to do, but it is something that we're working on, particularly with some of these long-term investors who are typically large sovereign wealth funds and other large investors.
Other questions from the audience? Hans?
Thank you. I think really interesting point came out of the last presentation. One of the nuggets I thought was the point that there is a problem around the investment chain. So the corporate pension funds send the wrong signal to the asset manager, and then it goes all around. So we have talked a lot about the interaction between CEO and asset managers, but we haven't really talked an awful lot about the first wrong signals, which come also from corporate pension funds and other asset owners. So question to the panel, and we just talked incidentally, what can asset owners do to send better long-term signals to the asset managers, and how can the relationships be structured, because this seems to be the fundamental underlying problem. Thank you.
I'll take that. And we don't get the same type of messages from our clients, but let me just take a crack at how we've addressed that flow of information and incentives in our business. So while we're known primarily as an index manager today, we still have a fairly sizable active business, which constitutes about a $500 billion in assets under management. And in that business, we've contracted with about 30 outside investment management firms. And what's really critical in the way we compensate those firms is on the basis of longer term relative performance. So it's not we're not evaluating our asset managers' performance, our active investment manager performance on a quarter-to-quarter or even annual basis. Each of those firms with whom we've contracted have incentive fees keyed against relative performance versus their benchmark over 3 or 5 years. So not extraordinarily long term, but certainly longer term than most active time horizons.
Can I add on to that as well? So I think you're absolutely right that and Vanguard's obviously figured this out, that the terms and conditions that an asset owner and an asset manager agree to really shape how that asset manager behaves when they're deciding whether to buy or sell a stock or give the CEO a hard time or whatever it might be. And I think that there are a number of things that they can agree to make that relationship longer term. And we're going to publish something on this shortly, but they are things like fees, contract terms, disclosure, things even like the way performance is reported. So just to give you almost a silly example, every performance report that I've ever seen says performance, versus the benchmark, 1 quarter, year to date, 1 year, 3 year, 5 year, et cetera. So one of our managers has actually decided to flip that, because if you start with 10-year performance, people only can hold so many numbers in their head, right? Because that's just the way the human mind works. So the theory is, now who knows if this will work? You start with 10-year performance, then 7, then 5, then 3. By the time you get to the quarter, there are too many numbers. Now, will that help? Who knows? But that's a low-cost way of trying to change the conversation. There are other things that most managers, when they report for the quarter, they start the letter, dear client, our performance for the quarter was 7.2% versus the benchmark, which was 6.9. So you can change the way you do that. You can talk about the annual performance. You can talk about interesting things that have happened in the quarter. So the way that I think we can change some of this is very much in the behavioral nudge. It's, why is that so short term? Can't we? Not that we're not going to disclose information, of course that's important, but how do you try to change the behavior both of the asset owner and the asset manager to be more focused on, I think as RuPaul was saying before, the actual goals of what the money is trying to achieve, rather than this sort of quarterly game that we've gotten ourselves into.
So maybe one more quick question. David, did you have your hand up? Okay, so we'll go with you.
Thanks, Bob. So I have a question about a data point that was mentioned at the beginning of the day around this flip that has happened with 80%. It used to be that 80% of the value was in tangible assets, and then 20% was in intangible, and that's flipped now. So my question is, what does it mean to have a long-term plan at all when so much of the value is tied with intangible things?
Who wants to take that one? Sarah, you want to do it?
Sure. So I think, therefore, the long-term plan has to be around the intangibles as well. So, back in the old days when 80% was in plant and equipment, your long-term plan would be, we're going to invest this in this factory and this, piece of real estate and other things that you can sort of touch and feel. I think that now it's got also to be about the brand, the reputation, the learning of the organization, the flexibility, all of those sort of things that are intangible, but we all know are valuable, because when a merger happens and people pay good money for things like a brand, you know that there's real value there. So, and that's why something like patents can be an important part of a long-term plan, even though they may or may not be on the balance sheet in the traditional sense of the word, like a factory would be.
Yeah, real quick, because we're running out of time.
So would you say that given the presentations today, would you say that the long-term plans that were presented, insofar as they were long-term plans, were focused on those intangibles?
I think they were more focused on the intangibles than the tangibles, perhaps. But I think I don't think that the accounting and whether it's intangible or tangible should drive the long-term plan. I think the long-term plan for any organization needs to be about whatever really drives its business. And if it's something tangible, like, assets in the ground, like a commodity provider, then that's what it should be about. But if it's something less tangible, like whether millennials think this is a cool brand, then that's what it should be about.
So we're coming at the end. I'd like to give each of you, real quick, since we wanted to provide some feedback to the SII folks, what would you say would be like the 3 key elements of a long-term plan? There's going to be another session in February. What are the 3 key elements of a long-term plan that they could give as guidance to the next set of CEOs?
I guess, I would say actual milestones, right? So I think Sarah made the point about numbers and years. I think as milestones to articulate progress against as we have the discussion about the plan over time, specific performance indicators over time between milestones. And I think the way, one particular perspective of ours would be, the way incentives are aligned, the way board composition and the skills in the boardroom are aligned to that plan over time as well.
Thank you. Amy?
Same. No. I do agree with those, but I would just add materiality. We heard a little bit about that today, and we didn't actually speak a lot about that. It's something we want to do more of, but how companies came to understand what's material to their business and how that relates to the long-term plan. And some of us don't have fully fleshed out metrics, so if those aren't available, how you plan to get there.
Thank you. Marjorie?
Building off of what's been said, in the foundation world, when we talk about grants, we think about, with every grant, dollars, dates, and deliverables. And when I'm thinking about a long-term plan, I'm thinking about what's the value, so what's the impact measure, and how are you thinking about impact if we don't have a measure yet. I also think dates are critically important. By when are we thinking about seeing the societal change? And the deliverables, what do we expect to change? I think we heard a lot about the aspirations that stood behind a lot of these long-term plans, and I'd like to get more into the deliverables that we seek.
Thank you. Sarah?
So quickly, I would just say the key KPIs that drive a business, the key risks or assumptions that could derail plans, because we all know businesses have those, and then the role of the board and how they see the role of the board as being the long-term driver or steward of that strategy.
Great. Thank you very much. Thank you, panel.